All right, we can get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and our whole team is complete. Okay, I'll pass it on to Fatima. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for waiting. Unfortunately, I had some technical issues, but now I'm here. It's really happy to be here with all the Climate Detectives teams. And also, of course, with our invited expert that we will present also in a few minutes. I will then start now sharing my screen. Please let us know if you have any issues seeing my screen. I just have to ask you, Shamira, please, if you could give me the right to share my screen. Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. So, okay, I think you should now all be seeing my screen. So once again, welcome. So today we are joined here by 33 Climate Detectives teams. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. We have teams joining us from 9 European countries, and we also have our guest teams joining us from Brazil. So this is really also very exciting for us to have your students and teachers from so many different European countries. So just before we start the event, just some rules if you are following us on WebEx. Perhaps you already noticed that during the event through WebEx, you will be muted and your camera will be off during all the event. In case you have any questions, I'm sure that also many of you have also already identified where we have the Q&A panel. So you can find it on the right side of your menu. Then it will open the Q&A panel. And by asking a question, we kindly ask you to please address your questions to all the panelists. And we will try to answer all the questions that we may have at the end of our session. Also then, just to give you an idea of how the event will be. So we have received many and great questions from all of you. So we will try to answer them during this event. But of course, if at the end, if you still have any questions, we will still try to answer some of your questions. So for those following us on YouTube, also welcome. And we hope that some of your questions will be answered today here. Just also before we start, because we have been talking with many of you, so we thought it would be nice also for you to know our team, the ESA Climate Detectives team. So my name is Fatima Pinto. I work for ESA Education, where I'm mainly responsible for the development of Earth observation related activities. So how can we monitor and study our planet from above? Shamira, please, if you want to say a few words also.
Hi, everybody. So nice to have you here. And my name is Shamira. If you don't know how to pronounce, it's like Shakira, but with an M. And I am just a recent master's graduate student, and I'm working under Fatima and the supervision of the ESA Education team on Climate Detectives.
Thank you, Shamira. And of course, we belong to a big team that is ESA Education team. And just very quickly then, an overview of the event today. So we will start very shortly with an introduction also to our expert. Then we will discuss topics related with weather and climate. Also, many of you have questions about satellites, so that's why we also added here a topic about Earth observation satellites. We will also see some questions that you had about climate change and extreme weather events. We will then conclude the event, and if we have the time, we will still try to answer some of your questions that if you are following us through WebEx, you can always use the Q&A panel to write your questions. And I will now give the word to Shamira for her to present us our invited scientist.
Hello again. And so as you can see on your screens, we have Beniamino Abis here, who is an expert in the field of Earth observation, and we're very lucky to have him as our Climate Detectives guest scientist. So welcome, Beniamino, and thank you so much for being here. And he has a background in mathematics and a PhD on the dynamics of the boreal forest with respect to climate change. So since 2019, Beniamino has been working at Progressive Systems in supporting ESA ESRIN, which is in Italy, as an expert in climate and Earth observation. Interested in outreach, he tries to explain science by combining compelling visual stories and relatable concepts. So welcome, Beniamino. And for our first question, a few questions actually, I'll pass it on to Beniamino to introduce himself, but a few teams here, like from Team Air Monitoring and Team Moon Sun, and a team from Sweden, Rosendal Skolan, is asking, when did you find out about when did you want to become a scientist, or why did you choose such a profession? I know scientists are monitoring sea surface temperature, land surface temperature, and polar ices. What are you monitoring and studying as a scientist?
Okay, thank you, Shimira, for the nice introduction, and thank you all for inviting me today. Actually, it's really a pleasure to be here. And yeah, let's say a few words about this. You can go maybe to the next slide. So I kind of always liked science already as a kid, but I liked a bit everything. So I liked a lot archaeology, for instance. I liked a lot space science, but it took me time to decide that I wanted to become a scientist. And in particular, after I studied mathematics at the university, I joined ESA for what is called the Young Graduate Trainee Program. And this is 1 year of, let's say, work, can be research, depending on where you join. And I joined a team that was doing research on space applications. And in particular, I was trying to use mathematics to help that. And there I really got passionate about research, because I had the experience of trying to do it in a sort of confined environment. And after that, I decided to continue and pursue a PhD. And I got really involved into climate change and forest dynamics. And I then started studying the boreal forest in particular, so all the northern forests in Canada and Russia, Northern Europe. I used a lot of mathematics in this, but I also started using a lot Earth observation, satellite data, and I was trying to mix it with mathematical models, with big global climate models, and I really became passionate about it, and I decided to continue in that direction, and that led me here to what I do today, which is Earth observation applications. I help other researchers. I do some additional work on the validation, so controlling the quality of data for fire observations, for instance, but also for forest, which is, let's say, my main topic remains forest dynamics, so to say. And in parallel, I started doing also a bit of outreach, like today. I have to say I'm liking it a lot, and it's both activities, the scientific ones and the outreach ones. I have to say that the reason to continue and that moved me mostly to this profession is, on one side, the curiosity, so the challenge of discovering new things, of analyzing problems, but also, let's say, the satisfaction that you get in doing something that it's good for everyone. So it's like trying to help the entire world, and I have to say, it's a good feeling.
Thank you, Beniamino. So it's also really interesting to see how from mathematics, then you are now studying climate, big systems, and also doing it from above. So it's really interesting. Thank you very much. So we will now then continue to some other questions that we have from the teams. So just also, even before doing that, we thought that perhaps it would be interesting if we discuss some concepts that are very important for the climate detectives teams and for the work that they are doing. So we would like to ask you about this difference between weather and climate. What is weather? What is climate? And what determines climate? And also considering that your work is also about forest vegetation, what is then the role of forests to our climate?
Yes, actually, these are very important questions that will help also understand the rest of some of the remaining questions from the teams. So let's start with the difference between weather and climate, that they might look like two different sides of the same coin. To put it simply, weather is what you get with conditions outside on Earth. So if you look outside the window right now, when you see it's sunny, is it raining, that's the weather. It can change within minutes, sometimes even less, within hours. And it's, to give a proper definition, is the temporary conditions of the atmosphere. Now, when we talk about climate, a useful definition, instead of what you get, is what you expect. So let's say that you want to go on holiday and you are going on a tropical island, for instance. You're going to expect some conditions for the weather, for the climate, and you're going to pack your suitcase depending on that. So what you expect is basically the climate, is the typical weather conditions over longer periods of time. We're talking about years, decades. A standard amount of time is normally 30 years. That is often used as reference. But essentially, this is the big difference between weather and climate. One is for longer time scales, and one is for very short time scales that can change between minutes or hours. Now, because the focus is mostly right now on climate, is after all climate detectives, what is actually determining the climate and the climate conditions on Earth? We can all trace it back to the energy that we have available on Earth. So, as you all know, we have a big source of energy, which is the sun, which is constantly emitting light and irradiating Earth. Now, when this light arrives, it has to pass the atmosphere. Part of this light, which is essentially energy, is going to be immediately reflected by the clouds and by the atmosphere. Parts of it is going to be absorbed by the atmosphere, and parts is going to arrive to the surface, being absorbed by the surface and heating it up. Now, as with any object, when you heat it up, you also are going to emit some energy from the object. Sorry for the noise. And this is what happens to the Earth. You heat it up, and then it's going to release some of this energy. And this energy, this heat emitted by the Earth, again, has to pass through the atmosphere. And in particular, some of it is getting absorbed by the atmosphere, and some of it is reflected and re-emitted towards the surface. So basically, you have two sources of heat that are arriving on the surface of Earth. There is the direct one to the sun, and is the one that is coming then from Earth back to the atmosphere and is re-emitted towards the surface. This is actually the part that is causing the changes in climate and determining the climate. How much of this energy is absorbed by the atmosphere and how much is reflected back to the Earth. You can imagine this as a lid that you are putting on a pot to make it boil faster. The better the lid, the more energy is going to get trapped, and the more your pot is going to heat up and boil faster. This is the same that happens with Earth. The more greenhouse gases we emit, the thicker the atmosphere becomes, and the more heat is trapped and reflected back on the surface. Now, when it comes then to the role of forest in this, because I'm saying it all depends on the atmosphere, it's not so simple. The forests have essentially three main roles. The first one is the heat absorption. To put it super simply, is like when it's summer and it's hot and you wear a white t-shirt. They tell you the white reflects more the heat, the light, and it doesn't absorb the heat. Now, the forests do the opposite. They are dark compared to, for instance, the snow, and they absorb a lot of heat. on the other hand, they also evaporate a lot of water. And this, same as when you sweat, releases some of the heat. So this causes a cooling. And then the effect that maybe we are most familiar with is the fact that the forest absorbs what we say sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and they stock it within themselves. And these are the three main regulation methods, let's say, that the forests have to interact with climate. We're going to talk a little bit more into details about some of these things to answer later questions, but for now I think is enough and we can go on with the next question.
Thank you, Beniamino. It's also very interesting to see the relation between the forests and climate. Thank you. So we will continue then with the question also related with this topic. So this is a question from a team from Spain, Enfriamiento Global. And they are asking, how can we take information for CO2 in our Earth in different years and places?
Yes, so this is it's a very important question, and this is actually how it all started. We have, let's say, 4 ways of dealing with measurements of CO2. We have the direct measurement done at stations, let's say. These are what are called in situ measurements or local measurements. So that means that there is an actual station doing measurements of parts of the air to see how much CO2 is present there. The most famous of such stations is the Mauna Loa station, which started in 1958 to collect data about the CO2 concentration. And this is what you see here on the top left image. This is actually the concentration of the CO2 detected at Mauna Loa, starting from 1958 and going up all the way to the last measurement that I found, which was at the end of February. And you can see that it's steadily increasing. Then we have a second type of data when we want to go and look more into the past. So let's say we want to go back before 1958, we're about thousands of years ago, then we have to use what are called like proxy data. So we need to find something that can tell us about the conditions of the atmosphere in the past. The most common one is the study of ice cores, and you can see a small picture of these, which are basically columns of ice, which we drill from certain places, for instance, in Greenland or in Antarctica. And by looking at the composition of the ice going deeper, we can say something about the conditions of the atmosphere and of the CO2 in particular. Looking then at more modern times, we have the satellite observations, which can give a global picture, or a more regional one at least, of the entire situation of the atmosphere. And these are data that look through the entire atmosphere over the entire Earth. And finally, we have what are called model reanalysis or model data. So this can be a mixture of satellite data and local measurement put together with a model that look, for instance, at the transportation in the atmosphere to give a global picture in very high detail. This, of course, requires a lot of extra additional work because you need to put together different sources of data with actual information on the conditions of the atmosphere. Some of this data can be accessed if, for instance, there is a local station near you. Some others are made available by big agencies like ESA, for instance. And some others are related to specific scientific projects and can be accessed normally through their databases. I think we can continue to the next one then.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really nice to see how important it is then to have these in situ and ground measurements compared then with satellite data. And also amazing to see how ice can give us information about our climate in the past. Thank you very much, Beniamino. That's really amazing. So we will still continue in the topic weather and climate. We have now a question from a team from Austria, the land of tree houses and explosive trees. They are asking, Could too much forest cover lead to a reversal of climate change and thus to global cooling? They have also a second question, which is a number of trees in urban areas more efficient in terms of CO2 reduction than the same number of trees in forests? I think two very good questions.
Yes, these are actually two very fascinating questions. So to answer them, specifically to answer the first one, we need to understand a little bit more about the role of the forest, as I was saying at the beginning. Now, we have talked about these three different effects. And the fact is that these three effects, they have, in one case, a warming effect on the atmosphere on Earth. And this is because they trap heat. And on the other one, they actually cause a cooling, the evaporation, like sweating, and the carbon sequestration. The balance between these effects is actually different depending on where the trees are and the type of forest. So it's different for a tropical forest, for a temperate forest, and for a boreal forest. So if we would completely fill the Earth with trees, we would really have to evaluate the balance, precisely the balance between these effects to understand what would happen. So we could potentially remove all the additional carbon, but this would not necessarily lead to a reduction in temperature because of the balance between these terms. And to evaluate that, we would need a very precise model of the entire Earth. What has been done so far? I mean, there have been studies in this direction, and in particular, there have been a couple ones that have estimated the fact that on Earth right now there are roughly 3 trillion trees, which are distributed a bit everywhere. And in many of these areas, it's possible to plant additional trees, restoring the natural capacity, let's say, of these locations. And we can still keep the balance between areas where there is forest and areas where there are humans, cities, for instance, or areas dedicated to agriculture. By doing this, actually, they have estimated that we could plant roughly 500 billion more trees, and this would reduce the atmospheric carbon by almost 25%, which would be enough, for instance, to negate the last 20 years of carbon emissions, or actually 20 years of emissions at the current rate. So this would be a very big impact that would go in the direction of reducing climate change. I think you can go to the next one. Yes, so when it comes to the role of, as we said, different trees in different locations, is also different if a tree is in a city or if it's in a forest that is far away, so for instance, a tropical forest. When it comes to the absorption of CO2, they are more or less the same. So an urban tree absorbs a little bit more than a faraway tree, let's say, a tree in the middle of a pristine forest. But they have other benefits and other roles which are also extremely important. So a pristine forest, a tropical forest, helps regulating the global water cycle, generating rainfall, clean air, helping regulate temperature and biodiversity. But trees inside a city, for instance, they help with soil erosion because they reduce it. They help in controlling stormwater and floods. They can provide shade from the sun so they can reduce the surface temperature. They also provide clean air, and they can improve the infiltration of water in the soil. And we're going to see later why this is extremely important. So once again, in terms of absorption of CO2, more or less the same, but they have different behaviors for a lot of other matters, which are very important in the local climate, let's say. So very nice question.
Thank you. Also very nice to see how, let's say, different forests may have also different roles in our climate. Thank you. So we'll now move to a different topic, satellites. And Shamira, you may perhaps introduce the next question.
Yes, thank you, Fatima. I think that image before was my favorite image of the whole presentation because it shows very well the forests. But yeah, so we have a couple questions on satellites already in the chat. But for today, a team from Austria, Heat Coolers, have already asked, how do satellites get into space? How exactly do they work? And another team, I guess Team Air Monitoring, it's asking, how can satellites have such accurate data and images, even when they are so far from Earth?
Yes, so these are also good questions, which is important to understand to have a better picture of how satellites work. Actually, we have some, I think, very nice videos from ESA that show how a satellite is put into orbit. So essentially, we have a launcher in which the satellite is carried, so it's at the top part. And this launcher is gonna bring the satellite into orbit and leave it there. And once the satellite is there, it's gonna continue going around Earth and make observations. Now, how do they make observations? Essentially, we have two types of satellites. We have passive and active satellites. Passive means that the satellite is taking pictures the same way, more or less, as you take pictures with a camera of what is underneath him. And in doing so is effectively collecting back the light that is reflected by the Earth's surface that is originally coming from the sun. So it's going to register the properties of the light, and it can have actually multiple cameras to cover a bigger area and to increase the resolution. But you have to think, when it comes to resolution, actually, that these satellites are, okay, quite far from the Earth, but the Earth is very big. So in terms of resolution, actually, they are not extremely high. What can be higher is actually active satellites, which are basically radar satellites mostly. I think most of you will be familiar with how a radar works. It's sending pulses, echoes, signals towards the Earth. So it's actively sending something. And then it's looking at the signal that gets back. It's like bouncing a ball over a surface. Depending on how the ball backs back to you, you can understand a bit how the surface is and you can understand its properties. And this is what happens with radar satellites. And because they send radar signals, they can send really high precision ones with incredibly high frequencies, and they can have extremely detailed analysis of the Earth's surface. And this can be much better in terms of resolution, let's say, than passive satellites. The drawback of that is that you have a smaller area covered, or that you need a lot of repetitions to cover the entire surface. So a big topic when it comes to satellite is always trying to balance the resolution with the global coverage, because this is one of the big advantages of satellites is the fact that we can monitor the entire Earth more or less at the same time, whereas with local stations, you would always have only a dot at a very specific point in the map. And you can have a lot of dots, but you will never be able to cover completely the Earth as you can with a satellite. And I think you can go to, yes.
That was perfect. Thank you, Beniamino. I think the team also that asked those questions say thank you in the chat, and that their students are all listening to your answer. So that's amazing.
Okay, and thanks, because I cannot see the chat right now.
Yes, it's good. So we have a few more questions about satellites. Everybody really wants to know also from Italy, a team called GLI Investigatori della Tre. I practice my Italian. As far as we have understood, the spatial resolution of Sentinel-5P is about 5 by 3 kilometers. Is there any way to obtain a more accurate spatial resolution from satellite images when investigating air pollution from space? Therefore, the presence of carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxide. Or another question from Greece, from Team Talos Nino Gymnasio Volucodo Dojo Botanicos, is asking, is it possible to have data for the satellite Sentinel of various gases so students can build their own ground sensors and compare their readings with the Sentinel measurements and analyze possible discrepancies from the ground? Or yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah, both good questions, and we can reconnect immediately with the previous one. So as I was saying, with satellites, we have to balance a little bit the trade-off between resolution and global coverage. And in particular, when it comes to measurements of the composition of the atmosphere, you have to add one factor, which is the fact that you have to understand the entire composition of the column of atmosphere under the satellite and not just a flat area. So this means that you have to analyze or collect 3D data and not just 2D data. And this is a lot more complex and heavy than a simple 2D analysis. So this is one factor. There are some methods to increase the resolution, and this goes into the direction of reanalysis or of combining different types of data. So for instance, it's possible to merge together ground local measurements over a city, for instance, together with the satellite ones, or to use some models to integrate the observations and have a highly detailed evolution between the different areas. This is what you can see in this image, for instance. This was a work that combined ground data together with satellite data for the NO2 over Amsterdam, and you can see that the resolution is really high. The problem is that these methods are quite complicated and they require extensive work before being able to even have the data that you can then use to perform your analysis. So in terms of accessible data right now, it could make sense to use both maybe data from a local station together with satellite data and to have them both at the same time for comparison without merging them with any technique that would be too complex, let's say, for the Climate Detective Initiative, because we're talking about top research right now. So now there are a lot of stations available that combine air data. You can find many of them in the Air Quality Index project. You can see this map on the right of the slide with all these dots. These are all air quality stations that you can check, and the data is available. They have a database divided by countries, and you can see what is available. And this goes for local stations. There are more that are not inside this network, for sure, but this is a good place to start. And you can also check maybe the weather agencies. Then, of course, there are ESA data, for instance, that are available from the Sentinel Hub. We have the Sentinel-5P, as mentioned, that actually looks at different gases present in the atmosphere to monitor air quality and air pollution. And these, of course, as we were saying, they don't have the same high resolution that you could have, for instance, with radar data, but it can be a very good point to start, especially considering that the atmosphere is very big and is normally quite well mixed. So the differences are not so felt between, let's say, 1 meter and the next. So we don't really need such extremely high resolution.
Perfect. I think that answers also some of the questions that are popping in the chat and the Q&A. They're asking a lot about satellites and resolution, so thank you. And okay, another question from Team Heat Coolers Austria. What data, other than the temperature, would you measure to detect the warming of an area? Satellite and or ground measurements?
Okay, so interesting question. And there are, of course, a lot of, let's say, signs that the planet or that an area, a specific region, is warming up. They can depend a little bit on where you are, so it's not always the same, and on what you are focusing. But to give you some examples, you could look, for instance, at the humidity and at the soil moisture. So if it's warming up, it can be that it's also getting drier, and there is less water available for plants or for agriculture, for animals as well. You can look at the vegetation status, or the health of the forests, of the vegetation. There are some specific indices that are possible to use, for instance, the NDVI. And these, they tell you basically if the vegetation is right now healthy, or if it's getting worse, or if it's really in bad conditions. There are the growing degree days, which are a sort of measure of the amount of heat that is available for plants, for instance. And if this increases, it means that the temperature is generally increasing. You can also look at more specific things related to temperature, which can be the proper distribution, the extremes, how many days of cooling and heating you have, and you can go on a little bit forever depending on the specific topic. If you are looking maybe at a coastal area or over sea, you can look at the sea level height, because this is directly related to the temperature. You can look at the sea temperature, you can look at the pH of the water, so if it's getting more acid, for instance, acidic, or you can look at the water heat content, which relates, for instance, to the density of the water. Or if you are in the mountains or you are in very northern regions, you can look at the presence of ice, or the presence of snow, at the status of the glaciers, if they are melting, if they are moving, if they are breaking. There is really a lot. There are a lot of descriptions of what could be helpful variables that you can find, for instance, from the Sentinel Hub education. If you go here to the custom scripts page, the level of details might be too high, but there is a nice description of a lot of these variables and how they can be used. So even if it's just to understand a bit more, I can recommend checking this page, which is very well structured.
Okay, thank you, Beniamino. It's really interesting to see all the interest around the satellites, and also amazing to see how from above, for example, we can also study sea temperature or even sea level height. I think that's really fascinating. So thank you very much for all these details. I think we could have a whole webinar just about satellites and how satellites can really monitor our planet from above. We will change now a little bit the topic, so we still have around 20 minutes to the end of our webinar. We have now a different question, but I think in the end it's also related with applications from satellites. So our next question is then about climate change. So this is a team from Spain, Steam Almare team. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but so they are studying the effect of climate change on the Albufera de Valencia wetland. They are saying that we have observed during the months of the year through the Sentinel-2 satellite with several filters. So they have looked to false color images and DVI, barren soil and agriculture. They would like to know, how can we see the effects of climate change using these different products? And are there other filters or satellites that give us more information on this subject?
Okay, this can easily become very technical, and of course there is plenty of information available. So a lot of variables, let's say a lot of indicators for climate change or for climate conditions are basically related to, as we were saying, the light that the satellite is receiving, the signal that it's receiving from Earth, and the information that it contains. This is normally related to some frequency bands, and combination of these bands are what you call filters. They can be, normally they're called indices if they have a specific connotation, and they give you some specific information. For instance, the NDVI, it's a very useful one that tells you the status of the vegetation. And a super simple way of looking at changes could be, for instance, to make a time lapse of the area of interest through time. It's relatively easy to do it from the EU browser or from the Sentinel Playground that is made available from Sentinel Hub. And there are actually also a lot of tutorials there that explain you really in detail how to do this. But if you want to go more into details, you could, for instance, make a time series analysis of the index in question. So let's say we stick to the NDVI, and we could look at the profile of how the NDVI changes over time. And you can see, for instance, in the image in the middle, that at some point there is a sudden drop. And this actually corresponded to a big fire. So you can see that the health status of the vegetation in that area really collapsed because there was no more vegetation essentially, and then it slowly started recovering again. Another way would be to make a composite image corresponding essentially to the time series, in which you combine images at different times, and you can see how the area changed over time in different colors. Again, at the Sentinel Hub Education, there is plenty of tutorials for this because it's not easy to explain so much in little time. And again, at the custom scripts page, you're going to have descriptions of many indices, what they are, how they are used, with examples on how to say something about them and analyze them. And there are some very good slides that actually go through the entire process of making some simple analysis in cases, for instance, of wildfires or for air pollution, for instance.
Thank you, Beniamino. It's really interesting that you mentioned that. I remember in the past, we also had a team from climate detectives that they have analyzed the NDVI index then to see how the vegetation in their city was recovering after big wildfires. So it was also interesting to use that index to see how vegetation was recovering from a fire. Thank you very much. So we have now one more question from the team, The Land of Tree Houses and Explosive Trees. They have also a very good question. So are you aware of any official plans to reduce methane and other greenhouse gases?
Okay, yeah, they also have a very cool name. Methane, first of all, it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's a lot more powerful than CO2. And since 1750, so since the, let's say, Industrial Revolution, it has more than doubled in the atmosphere. There is a fundamental difference with CO2, which is the time it remains in the atmosphere. So this, what is called the times of residence, is a lot shorter for methane than it is for CO2. So it's a lot, let's say it's easier to have an impact on reduction of methane and their effect on climate change than it is for CO2. That being said, the emissions from methane are 40-60 caused by natural phenomena and by humans' activity. Not necessarily directly by humans, but can be for energy, can be for agriculture, and these would all count as human. Both these types are actually increasing. And the natural one actually have the potential to increase even more because there is a lot of methane trapped underground, for instance, in where the conditions are proper for its formation. And I will stop it there without going into much detail. But when it comes to the human-induced emission, actually there is big potential for reducing them, especially in the energy sector, where it's possible to recover a lot of the wasted methane, let's say, and regenerate energy from that. So because of this, actually, it's possible, and there are starting to appear plans to recover this energy at zero effective cost, zero net cost, because you are actually investing in something that it's bringing additional energy to the system. Also, emissions from agriculture can be reduced not very easily, but can be reduced. And this is actually something where everyone can do a little bit, because a lot of these emissions are related to agriculture that is not used to feed humans, let's say, but is used to feed animals, for instance, or is used then for energy conversion. So by changing a little bit our habits, actually we can go and work on these emissions from agriculture and reduce them with our little actions, let's say.
Okay, thank you. So there is always something, even if small, that perhaps we can all do also to try to contribute. So still one more question on this topic. So this is a question from Bieno Climate Detectives team from Romania. So they are studying the impact of the coronavirus lockdown on the Romanian climate. So they would like to ask you what global changes you have noticed, and what advice would you give them for their investigation?
Okay, yeah, of course the lockdowns have impacted us all. Now, in the last year, not for the entire year, but for many months, we have really seen the number of flights to decrease. We have seen the demand and consumption of oil and energy decrease. It's also possible to notice that the soil vibrations have decreased. So if we measure the amount of vibrations of the entire Earth, because there was less movement on it, we can see that they decreased. And at the same time, the noise went down. And in many places, air and water quality improved a lot. Now, these are all local effects, as you can see, for instance, in the pictures on the left. The top one is related to air quality, and you can see the difference from January to February, when the lockdown was put in place over China, the reduction of emission in NO2. The bottom one instead is the water quality over Venice. Now, this is looking at the amount of suspended matter in the water. And you can see basically yellow and red is bad and the darker blue is better, to put it simply. And you can see the difference when the lockdown was in place. So from before to after. Now, as I was saying, these are all local effects, but when we look at the bigger picture of the trends in CO2 and climate change, these did not really register. And actually the trend of CO2 is almost unaffected. There was, yes, a little drop, but this is not enough to make a change, especially considering that climate change has a lot of inertia. So as we said, the CO2 stays in the atmosphere. We just said that it stays longer than methane, but actually the CO2 takes hundreds of years to disappear. So even if we would stop completely emissions today, it will still take time for the climate of the Earth to adapt to that. So for that, it's not really possible to see the effects of these individual lockdowns at the global level. So my advice would be to focus on the local effects, because those were many and some of them were extremely important. So particularly the ones related to traffic, to air and water quality, and I would start focusing on those.
Thank you, Beniamino. Thank you for your nice advice. Sometimes it's easier to see it locally and it's possible. So thank you. So still related, but related now with extreme weather events. So we have one team from Ireland, FENOR NES, that they are investigating storms, and they are asking, why are storms so prevalent in recent times? What human activities can we embark in to reduce the negative impacts of storms?
This is let's say, a very complicated question, and actually has a lot of different levels necessary to answer it. And we also have to say a little bit about the types of storms, because it's different if we are talking about tropical storms, hurricanes, for instance, to mid-latitude thunderstorms. Now, one of the many factors which are affecting storms is the amount of heat present in the atmosphere. The warmer the atmosphere is, the more water vapor it can contain, and the more energy it has available to develop storms and to rain over the surface. So because we are warming up the atmosphere, we are actually giving more energy to feed storms. Now, when it comes to hurricanes, what we have seen in the last few years actually is a change in the patterns and in the locations where the tropical storms are forming, more than in the number of storms. And we have seen also some changes in the amount of time that it takes them to gain up energy and speed. When it comes instead to thunderstorms and mid-latitude storms, they have generally been increasing, especially in the quantity of water that is rained in a single time. So we're talking about extreme events. Maybe the overall amount of rain that falls over 1 year in a specific location did not change that much, but the way it rained changed. There are a lot of possible activities to work on mitigating or adapting to such conditions, from actually studying these extreme precipitation events and making better analysis and maybe better forecasts, because part of it is really understanding better how all of these systems form and interact. An important thing is actually to monitor and model the groundwater conditions, because this affects, for instance, the floods, and try to reduce the inflow of water into the sewage or basically below the cities, for instance. It's possible to increase the amount of green areas in cities. It's possible to use restoration plans, and there are actually some like storm breakers walls that can be built. But a lot of effort should also go, for instance, on the forecasting and to understanding these weather phenomena. And of course, if we can reduce emissions, we can possibly reduce, let's say, the energy available for the storms. So that as a byproduct should also help this situation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Beniamino. So we are running a little bit out of time, but we will still try to answer at least all the questions that we received from the teams in advance. So these questions are from an Italian team, hashtag Climate Green. So they would like to know the reason why the rain accumulation causes flooding of the streets. So also linked with what we have seen already a little bit before. Can we resolve this problem, and how we perform a solution for our country? How can we contribute in our daily gestures to avoid that so much rain falls in such a short time?
So the reason why we have so much floods of the street is very simple, is the fact that a normal street, concrete or of bricks, cannot really soak the rainwater. So once rainfall arrives on the surface, it starts running on top of the streets, and the only place where it can go down is in the drains. Now, when it rains a lot, the drains fill up immediately, and then you have basically flash floods all the time, filling the streets with water. Now, the reason why this happens is because the water cannot be absorbed by the soil. So one way to actually improve this, if we go to the next slide, would be to have a way for the water to be soaked up by the surface. Now, there are some possibilities for streets, like well-drained gravel. There are some specific asphalts that are more permeable. But the best way, for instance, would be to have more trees and generally more green. Because what happens when there is a tree is that, first of all, some of the water is intercepted by the leaves. So it doesn't actually reach the surface. It's stopped by the tree itself. Then, when water reaches the soil, if there is a tree or if there is soil compared to concrete, actually part of the water can go down into the soil. And because it can be absorbed, it doesn't flood up immediately, and it has space and time to flow away at another time and at another place. So this would be basically why it happens, and at the same time what we can do. A simple thing would be to have more green or specific types of streets that can absorb the water.
Thank you. Interesting also that now that we are almost concluding, also we are going back to the beginning and also to the role of vegetation and forests once again. So we have just some more questions to conclude, and Shamira we'll ask them. Shamira, please.
Yes, so a team researchers wanted to ask, why are clouds white? This is the simplest question, but also a good way, I think, to end.
I mean, this is a good question. It's actually not so simple, but let's say so. The light from the sun is more or less white. So the visible light is more or less white. Now, the clouds are white because the light from the sun is white. So what happens is that when the light passes inside the cloud, it interacts with the water droplets that are inside of it, and it gets scattered in more or less all directions, more on the top and on the side and a bit less on the bottom, simply because the light is arriving from the top. And it gets scattered more or less in the same way for all the colors that are composing the sunlight. So I think you all have seen this experiment where you have a prism and you pass the light from the sun, and on the other side you actually get a rainbow. So the water droplets are scattering the light in all its components at the same way, so the light remains white. And this is why the clouds appear white. And in fact, if you go to the top of the clouds, even when they seem gray from below, the top will always be white. Now, what happens when there is a lot of water in the cloud and they become more gray is because the light cannot really pass through. It gets blocked by all the water, and they appear from below more gray, for instance. But to put it simple, clouds are white because the light from the sun is white.
May not be a simple question after all. And I think so. This is the last question that we have from our webinar, and I think this is a good way to end off also on Beniamino's profession and his career and his dreams. So when working in this profession, what is the biggest difficulty to exercise, and what tip would you give to anyone who wants to follow the same branch that you are in?
Okay, this is a very tough question. So to practice this profession, I mean, there are different ways of practicing. You can work more related to Earth observations, you can be a field scientist, you can be a modeler, but what they all have in common, I think, is that they need a lot of curiosity and a lot of patience. And you need to be curious about what you're doing, and you need to put some patience into understanding all the different components. It can be that they need a bit of mathematics, they need a bit of physics, they need a bit of computer science, and you need to be patient to build up little by little all the pieces to understand better the picture. And I think this is basically the advice, is like, be curious and be patient into following these, and don't be scared about the mathematics or the physics. It's all fun.
Yes, math is fun. So I think now we have a few minutes only because we started a little bit later. So we have maybe 1 minute for questions. And I've seen that some teams have already put their questions on the Q&A. And to answer, one of the teams called Brigada Verde from Portugal is asking, so Portugal has lost a lot of forest area in the last years due to deforestation and fires. Is it possible to assume that in some years that this will affect definitely our climate?
Yes. So every time that there is changes in the forest cover, let's say, these have both a local and a non-local effect, so to say. So the local effects are the one related immediately to the area surrounding it. So we have less shadow, for instance, so the surface can heat up more, but also we are changing basically we are changing the water cycle. So we are changing the amount of water that is recycled through the atmosphere. So we are changing the amount of rainfall that would be available, for instance. And because the atmosphere mixes, all these changes after a while actually have an effect. It might be small, but it's going to be an effect on the overall climate. So some effect will be maybe not seen, but will be present. A difficult thing is understanding what effect relates to which factor, because of course there are so many factors happening and interacting at the same time. Awesome.
I think we have time for maybe one more question before I pass it on back to Fatima, but a question from Team Austria. Erdschützlinge is asking about algae and CO2. So does algae or algae absorb more CO2 than trees?
They are, that's actually a very good, so they are essentially comparable. They are extremely important as well into absorbing CO2. It's, let's say, it's a little bit harder to monitor them because they are underwater and we have problems seeing through water, at least from satellites. But it's possible in some cases to monitor, for instance, if they are very active. But yes, they are comparable to forests in terms of absorptions of CO2.
Okay, thanks, Beniamino. And I know we have a lot more questions on the Q&A and the chat, but I will post the Climate Detective's email on the chat and the Q&A, just so that if we didn't answer your questions today, we can answer them and you can ask Beniamino or ask the questions later on. But I'll pass it on to Fatima to end us off.
Thank you very much, Amira. Thank you, Beniamino, for answering all these questions. I think it was really amazing, and I hope that we all learned a lot today. And also, I hope that we have inspired all the Climate Detectives teams to continue their work. So just really to conclude this webinar, just mention where we are now on the Climate Detectives project. So we are now on phase 2. You have all been now investigating your climate problem. So congratulations to all of you. You made it to phase 2. And our final message is really just keep up the great work that you have been doing. And we are really looking forward to see your results and also your positive actions, because also the message is that we can all try to make a difference. So thank you all once again for joining us. Thank you also, Beniamino, for your time and for answering all the team's questions. And yes, as also just Shamira mentioned, if then you have also any other questions, you can always send us an email to climate.detectives@esa.int, and we will always try to answer as many questions as possible. So thank you everyone for joining. And we really wish you good luck with your investigations and also with your school year. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, Beniamino. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.